Hi, everybody. My name is Maureen Bonifin. Welcome to this 1-hour HRSA overview. I'll be your guide for today. A very brief snippet about myself. Before I launched my consultancy about 2 years ago, I worked for an institute of higher education for 16 years. And during that time, I worked with all different types of funders, including HRSA. Most of the HRSA work I did was in the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, securing funding for our Child and Family Research Center housed within our Office of Extension. I have experience with almost all of the different types of federal funders, from NIH to CDC to DOD to DOE to Department of Education. But right now, most of my work comes from the National Science Foundation and the USDA. However, today we are here to focus on the health science side of the federal funding portfolio. And I have a lot of information to get through today, so hang in there with me. We'll look at the Health Resource and Services Administration, also known as HRSA today. We're going to explore their mission, their funding priorities, and talk a little bit about how to secure funding for your project or your program. We're going to talk a bit about strategy and the difference between writing for a HRSA grant and any other health and human services grant. We're not going to go into the details because it is only an hour, but we are going to look at those differences. Okay, HRSA is a division underneath the Health and Human Services Agency of the federal funding portfolio. And as such, there's a lot of crossover and similarities between HRSA grants and the National Institute of Health, NIH, and the Center for Disease Control's, the CDC. But there's also a lot of critical differences, and we're going to get over those in the second part of this webinar. But first, let's dig into HRSA's priorities. So, HRSA's mission is to improve health outcomes and achieve health equity through access to quality services, a skilled health workforce, and innovative high-value programs. They achieve this by taking actionable steps toward improving access to quality health services and providing support to increase the health workforce through training and also to grow health infrastructure. Their programs support equitable health care for the nation's highest need communities. And that is people who are geographically isolated and economically or medically vulnerable. And this includes people with low incomes, people with HIV, pregnant women, children and parents, transplant patients, rural communities, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and those unable to access high-quality health care. They have 18 bureaus and offices, providing 90-plus programs to more than 3,000 grantees. However, for our purposes today, we're only looking at the 7 bureaus that provide grant funding. The other bureaus may provide loans or scholarships or may be responsible for HRSA operations or other types of funding mechanisms. Let's dig in a bit more into HRSA's funding priorities. So with the incoming federal administration, this year might be a little bit harder to predict what their priorities are going to be in the next year or two than it has been in years past. And those priorities from this current year, 2024, are on the right side of your screen. We might have to do a bit of waiting this year. They didn't put out a webinar this fall, so we don't know what those priorities are. I think they're waiting to figure out what the new administration is going to do with the budgets. However, that being said, HRSA does provide some critical programs that for the most part do align with the priorities of the incoming administration. And I do expect that the most critical programs that HRSA oversees will continue to be funded at some level going forward. And that especially includes the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, their rural health emphases across different bureaus, and their response to the next health crisis work that they do. Now let's look closer at the offices that give funding. There are 7 different bureaus on the left or the right-hand side of your screen. Of those 7 bureaus that fund grants, there are 3 in green that fund academic researchers and institutes of higher ed. which I'm focusing on for this webinar today, and we'll dig into later in a minute. Of the remaining bureaus, the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy and the Office of Administration in blue also do fund institutes of higher ed, but for the most part, they're funding community organizations. So if you are an institute of higher ed, you need to have connections with those communities and be willing to do outreach and training for the programs that receive other HRSA funding to do work in the community. Now, occasionally you will get lucky and there might be some research funding within those bureaus. So I would still keep an eye on those, especially going forward if we see the new administration focusing on rural health even more than they currently are. So the last two bureaus, the Bureau of Primary Healthcare and the Health Services Bureau, rarely have funding for academics. The Bureau of Health, the Primary Care Health Bureau, as the name implies, funds organizations that are on the ground in the community providing that primary care. So not likely that they're going to have much funding for academics. The Health Systems Bureau seems to have had much of their funding appropriated into other bureaus in recent years via the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. And going forward, we might see a bit more of that streamlining across both HRSA and other federal funding agencies. Now let's dig into the actual funding numbers a little bit. So in fiscal year 2024, HRSA had a $144.3 billion budget in discretionary funds, and these focused on addressing behavioral health crisis, preparing for the future of public health threats, and expanding access to care. And then in this current fiscal year, 2025, which began in October, the budget reduced to $130.7 billion, a slight reduction if you consider that in billions of dollars. And this year, we're focusing on American families, improving behavioral health, and preparing for the next public health crisis. So again, I think priorities from both of these fiscal years are going to repeat in upcoming years. Now, digging down into the bureau level, let's take a look at the three most prominent bureaus for academics. And all three of these bureaus had essentially flat budgets between fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024. There was no information on HRSA's website about this current fiscal year 2025, but going forward, I would expect this flat line budget trend to continue or maybe even reduce just a bit. Okay, so how do you keep track of these shifting funding priorities and understand what funding opportunities may reoccur and when they may reoccur? There are several different databases that you can use to monitor funding, including the HRSA website, which is good for an initial search, especially if you're looking to target a specific bureau. You can find that bureau's priorities in the HRSA website and look at their past funding trends. There are also several different databases that you could be of interest to you as an academic. One of them is Grant Forward. This is a low-cost database that you can use to find funding through very regular search criteria. And then there is Adam Grants, which is a brand new database that uses semantic search to return better results when you use natural language to describe your research. And so Adam Grants uses these new LLM models, large language models, to do searches based on the connotations of the words that you use. And so they look for similar words across all of the funding opportunities to return a better search result than your standard searches do. Both of these databases do allow access to custom reports, so you can put in all the information you want to put into your profiles to get your funding delivered to you. And they will send you automatic emails periodically. You can schedule how often you want that to let you know when new funding is coming out that may be of interest to you. However, for me personally, when I'm looking at past trends and trying to forecast opportunities, I still prefer grants.gov. And I know it's still kind of clunky and old school, but the table it provides is easily visible with the information you need, and it's downloadable and manipulatable. So I still use this as the primary location when I'm looking at trends. And on your screen is a process for doing this search. So first you're going to use a Boolean search in the search bar to search for whatever terms you want to look for. In this case, we were looking for the health field initiated innovative research funding opportunity. So I put that in quotes. And then you're going to click all of the opportunity statuses under the opportunity status level. That way you get both forecasted, your existing open calls, and your closed and archived calls. And then, so you don't get everything across all agencies, you're going to look for HHS and click the drop-down button there. So turn your plus into a minus. And then within the sub-agencies that pop in under HHS, you're going to look for HRSA and click that one. So you only get HRSA funding opportunities. So that's going to return the list that is on your screen in the table. And then I like to sort that list by the posted date. You could do the closed date. I prefer the posted date so that I see when the trends for when these come out. And that's going to show you about how often things that are in a similar vein as to the funding opportunity you're looking for occur across HRSA. And if you log into grants.gov before you do this search, you can save the search by clicking the button in the upper right-hand corner. And that will help you return to the search in the future. And if I'm remembering right, it also sends you notifications when new things come into the search. Okay, let's dig into the different Bureau funding opportunities. So HRSA funds many, many different types of activities, including training, work for workforce development, outreach and community education, research, and scholarships and loans. And for each of the bureaus that I'm going to dig into, we're going to highlight different opportunities in these sectors. So the first bureau I want to highlight is the Bureau of Health Workforce. And they have the broadest discipline coverage, funding any health discipline that could impact the health workforce. Their mission is to strengthen the health workforce and connect skilled healthcare providers to communities in need. They award grants to organizations such as institutes of higher education, K-12, schools, hospitals, and health centers. Their priorities include behavioral health, mental health, geriatrics, medicine, nursing, oral health, and public health. So it's quite a broad range of health disciplines that serve the public. Currently, when I developed this webinar, which was about a week ago, there were 2 open calls and 106 archived calls. This year, they had 15 open funding opportunities, so you're seeing about 1 come out a month. They provide grant funding and training for programs, existing workforce upskilling, and outreach programs and research. So did I say training programs? Training programs is included in there. They also offer scholarships and loan repayment to students and clinicians. Okay, let's dig into some of the reoccurring opportunities for this bureau. And since this bureau focuses on the health workforce, most of the funding that goes to institutes of higher ed is in the vein of training students. So undergraduates, graduates, residents, as well as outreach activities. You do occasionally get funding or research for funding opportunities in here, and I'll show you one of those on the next slide. Okay, on this slide is a sampling of training funding opportunities, and we're going to use the Bureau of Health Workforce Education and Training program on the top of the screen as the main example of what these programs look like. So established in 2014, this bureau focuses on increasing access to behavioral health care services in medically underserved communities. Their goal is to provide didactic and experiential training, increasing clinical supervision of trainees. And they do this in the hopes that graduates of this training will eventually go on to serve the community in which they trained to improve the quality of mental health care services in these underserved communities. They have funding opportunities for training of professionals, nurses, paraprofessionals, also like medical aides, and other types of assistance. And under the new administration, maybe not for this particular program, but for other related programs, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see if doulas also included in these paraprofessionals. They fund on a 3 to 4 year funding cycle, and each cycle focuses on a different population. So this current cycle, which is due January 21st, focuses on professionals. Their budget is 2.4 million over 4 years. That's how much you can get for your grant. And they plan on awarding up to 101 grants, that gives you a pretty significant chance of being funded. Do note that 50% of the budget that you receive in your grant must go towards student support stipends at rates set by HRSA. The rest of the budget goes toward everything else that's needed to execute their training, including providing the supervisors, including trainee tuition, including cost of developing your curriculum, and so on and so forth. Also on your screen are other opportunities that support training. I did want to highlight the Nurse Education Practice and Quality Retention Program, as there is a similar program that's coming out, scheduled to come out in March. So the goals of this program is to provide quality training to increase the nursing workforce, both in underserved communities and in acute long-term care settings. This is on a 1 to 2 year funding cycle. And again, that focus changes every year, but the goal remains the same, to educate more nurses. So for your grant, you could get up to 4 million over 4 years, and they plan on awarding only 5 grants. So that is a significantly less chance of getting funded than the prior one, but I would still try for it. So there is a forecasted nursing workforce diversity opportunity that's scheduled to come out in March, and it's on your screen. There's not much out there on it because it is just a forecast. But if you're interested in this, I would use the Nursing Education Practice Quality Retention funding opportunity to start prepping, because I would expect that the requirements for the grant are going to be similar. We're just going to be focusing on diversity rather than general pieces. Okay, on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the Geriatrics Workforce Enhancement Program and the Health Careers Opportunities Program. And both of these have similar training goals to the other opportunities I just highlighted. They want you to work with the community organizations for training of these populations. Both are on a 3 to 4 year funding cycle, and the budget are on your screen so you can see how much is there. And both of them award a maximum of 43 grants, at least in the last cycle, which gives you a mid-range ability, like chance of winning. So the geriatric proposals were due last February. I would keep an eye out for similar training opportunities to be released around this time of the year in 3 to 4 years' time. And for the health careers, which is much more general, these were due in May of 2023. So I would keep an eye out for this opportunity to be released early spring in 1 to 3 years' time. Okay, moving on to scholarship programs. So scholarship grants give funding to accredited healthcare schools so that they can give out scholarships. And through this process, HRSA aims to improve the distribution, diversity, and supply of primary care providers to medically underserved communities. So scholarship programs are similar to training grants in terms of the requirements. However, they only give out funding to support the student's tuition, educational expenses, and living expenses. They don't provide support for the programs that are needed to help those students succeed, but they do expect you to have those programs. And as such, you're going to need to leverage existing resources at your institution and state how those resources might be modified a bit in order to address the needs of this particular student population that's receiving the scholarships. Note, you might be able to request some of your project director's salary. In the case of the one on your screen, it was up to 25% of their time. But that was the only type of administrative or program support cost that's allowable on this grant. Usually it is only funding scholarships for students. So the budget for the one that's due February 19th is $3.25 million for 5 years. And they plan on awarding a maximum of 85 grants. So we have a significant chance of getting this funding. And this funding is going to support disadvantaged students. I expect they're trying to get that out before the incoming administration comes in. Note, getting these types of grants will often require that you work with your financial aid office, both at the time of proposal to understand the tuition amount that you need to request in your budget, and once funded to ensure that scholarships are distributed according to the university and HRSA policies. So these scholarships are on a 1 to 3 year funding cycle, and the focus changes each funding cycle. Let's move on to a research funding opportunity. These are fewer in this bureau, and generally they are one-off opportunities when the bureau has a need for collecting data or for getting evidence of something for their programs. However, the one on the screen is one of the few reoccurring opportunities, and it's a center opportunity, and that's a whole thing. So this is the Health Workforce Research Center Cooperative Agreement Program. It funds centers for research that strengthen evidence-based policy and enhance understanding of health workforce planning and policy at all levels. They expect the center to collect, analyze, and disseminate health workforce program data to both HRSA and to the public. The center needs to provide technical assistance to community-based health entities. So you need to be acting as a translator of knowledge back to the community. And you also need to serve as a liaison to enhance collaboration, research, and dissemination of health workforce research among center partners and across communities. The center's research needs to focus in general on the role of workforce in delivering health services and the workforce's implementation of evidence-informed strategies and interventions, and in investigating workforce composition needs, sufficiency, and distribution. You also need to address workforce development methods. You also could address, you don't have to, address workforce development methods, including recruitment, training, and models. And I definitely haven't covered everything on this slide. I haven't covered any of the nuances here. So if you're interested in this funding opportunity, definitely go look at that RFP and see what else you could focus on. So this opportunity cycles on a 3 to 4 year cycle. It was last released in April of 2022 with a focus on public health, behavioral health, and health equity. So if you're interested in this, I would expect the call to come out again in 2 to 3 years' time around the beginning of the year. And the last funding cycle had 2 levels of awards. The behavioral health and public health level was $4.5 million for a 5-year grant, and everything else was $2.5 million for 5 years. And they planned on awarding 9 centers, which is pretty high for a center grant. Usually I see between like 1 and 5 centers being funded. Okay, let's move on to the next bureau. The goal of the Maternal and Child Health Bureau is to improve health and well-being of America's mothers, children, and families by assuring access to high quality and equitable health services and strengthening the public health capacity and workforce that serves mothers and children. Of note, HRSA considers mothers and children to include women of childbearing age, pregnant women, infants, and children with special healthcare needs, as well as children and adolescents in general. And looking at the incoming administration goals, I would not be surprised to see that this Bureau actually expands its scope, especially around adoptees, which is something this new administration is interested in. They will also want to include the father more in the types of initiatives that HRSA has. And they also want to place even more emphasis on equipping mothers and caregivers in connecting them with improving their understanding of infants, toddlers, and young children. Currently, they have 4 open opportunities and 143 archived opportunities. And this year they had 19 open funding opportunities, so about 1.5 a month. They provide funding for outreach programs, workforce training programs, and research. So for this Bureau, I wanted to focus on the research opportunities, as they have a few more of these than the other bureaus did. So this first one provides some flexibility in what you study and who is involved in the project, similar to how you would expect to see NIH opportunities. So the Maternal and Child Health First opportunity aims to advance health and well-being and improve health equity for mothers and children by supporting innovative, applied, and translational intervention research. It gives researchers an opportunity to explore diverse topics and regional and national significance. The study should address a significant gap in the body of knowledge on effective interventions available to the maternal and child health field. Outcomes of these studies should influence clinical practice, healthcare services, and provide early interventions to underserved communities. The last budget cycle provided $9,000 over 3 years for your grant, and they planned on awarding only 2 grants. So it is a challenging one to win, but I do recommend you try for it. This is on a 2 to 3 year funding cycle. It was last due in February 2023. So I'd expect it to be announced around this time in the next 1 to 2 years. I mean, I would expect it to be coming out right now. But if it doesn't come out right now, look for it in another 1 to 2 years. Okay, the next opportunity highlights how HRSA usually funds research. So they generally ask researchers to provide data or evidence to support their program priorities. They want to back up the fact that there's a need for their programs. This is a secondary data analysis research grant. It supports research to analyze existing national data sets or administrative records to answer questions that can improve the health and well-being of mothers and children. Specifically, they're looking to strengthen and expand the evidence base for HRSA's own funding priorities and the programs that they support, including the Title V Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant, the Bureau's strategic plan goals, and the Healthy People 2030 objectives. So this is probably not for everybody, but if you want to take a closer look at the national data sets, this could be for you. And the budget was $120,000 for a 1-year grant, and they plan to award 9 grants. This does usually cycle every 2 to 3 years. And the last cycle was due in 2022. So again, I would have expected it to be coming out right now, but if it doesn't come out right now, it would be coming out in a year or 2. Okay, the next 2 funding opportunities, the Health Policy Innovation Program and the Partnership for National Health Leadership Program, provide funding for outreach and workforce development. And while on the surface, these may not look like research grants, if these areas are of interest to you, they do provide a platform in which you can collect data and do evaluations, because you're going to be doing that anyways for these programs. And that data that you could collect could inform fundamental gaps in the body of policy knowledge within your discipline. So for the policy grant, it could be for policy scientists. For the leadership grant, we might be looking at health administration scientists, organizational leadership, organizational change fields. So the policy grant is a $1.2 million grant for 3 years, and they planned on awarding 5 grants. This thing is on a much longer funding cycle, every 7 to 8 years, and was due in July this time last year. So it's likely going to be a while before this reoccurs, but I wanted to highlight it because the incoming administration may be providing more funding for policy work in the other bureaus, especially maybe in that rural bureau. And I wanted to get you thinking about how you could use a policy study grant, outreach grant, to do some policy research. And the Leadership One awards 4 areas. The funding amounts are on your screen, and this one is on a 4 to 5 year cycle and is currently open due January 3rd. So if you have nothing to do on your Christmas break, this might be a way to get some funding for your leadership programs. Okay, so similar to the Health Bureau, Workforce Bureau, this Maternal and Child Health Bureau also has funding for community-based workforce training. And on your screen are the Public Health Catalyst Program and the Centers of Excellence in Health Education, Science, and Practice. The Catalyst Program is a true training program that provides $675,000 budget for 5 years, and they plan on awarding 10 grants. So this is also currently open, due January 23rd, and it's usually on a 4 to 5 year cycle. So if you don't have time to do this in the next 2 months, look for it again in another 4 to 5 years. Or look for similar training programs to come out within this bureau. So the Centers of Excellence grant encourages center level training activities for the next generation of graduates and postdocs. They also expect you to provide maternal and child health subject matter expertise to HRSA's block grant recipients. And they provide opportunities for supplemental funding to respond to emerging issues in maternal and child health. Now, it would be the supplemental funding where I would expect the actual research to happen. Everything else is training or outreach. So the base funding for this opportunity is $1.8 million for 5 years. They expect to award 13 of those grants. There's also opportunities for add-on fellowship funding for $170,000 per year. This opportunity is also currently open, due at the end of January as well, January 27th. It is a brand new opportunity, so if you're interested in it, I would probably try for it right now. And I'm unsure if it's going to continue. So if it does continue, that would be happening in the next 3 to 5 years, once they know if this round of funding is actually performing as anticipated. And the last bureau that I wanted to highlight today is the HIV/B and AIDS Bureau. This provides resources for a comprehensive system of HIV primary medical care, medications, and essential support services for low-income people with HIV. So they do this through 5 parts of the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. They improve the quality of and access to HIV healthcare support and medications to different populations and regions via the first 4 parts, parts A through D on your screen. And you'll occasionally see opportunities for institutes of higher education in these parts, but usually these parts are to help community-based groups deliver and strengthen their capacity for high-quality healthcare. So if you're going to be helping on one of these, it's most likely going to be in an outreach situation. Part F, however, funds different organizations, including academic health science centers and institutes of higher ed, to develop innovative models of HIV care and treatment. And much of the funding that academics can benefit from is located in this part. Currently, there is one open part, a Part C, and there are 94 archived opportunities. So this opportunity, or this bureau, had 21 open funding opportunities this year, with about half of those of interest to academics. But again, most of those opportunities were outreach activities or were for providing capacity support to community-based health organizations. So by that I mean having technical assistance for them or providing evaluation services for them. One thing to note with these opportunities from this bureau is often their location restrictions. So you might find the perfect call out there only to see once you get to the eligibility section that you're not eligible because your region or community is not part of the eligibility criteria. So watch out for that. Okay, let's move on to the HRSA proposal process and the differences between HRSA and the other health and human service agencies, such as NIH and CDC. There are a lot of things that overlap between these different sub-agencies of HHS. So if you've ever done an NIH grant or a CDC grant or another HHS grant, you are well set up to write a HRSA grant. And because of that, I'm only going to focus on the things that are different here. Let's start with how to write a strong application. The guidelines on your screen are directly from HRSA's website, and I want to call out the pieces that make HRSA unique. So first, applications may be 80 pages or less. And while you may think that 80 pages is a lot, this includes non-standard documents and they ask for a lot of information. And I'll get into why this is a problem in the next slide. Your goals and objectives are similar to other funding agencies, so I'm not going to cover those. You can see them on your screen. And then need section, I wanted to highlight that besides justifying your need in the normal way around population or around the body of knowledge gap, they're also looking more closely at your organization's track record in fulfilling the need of your population. You must have data and evidence that your team has past experience in working with this type of population and that you have in fact helped them to address their needs. Now, moving on to the resources and capabilities section, I wanted to highlight the sentence that starts with elaborating on your organization's knowledge and staffing, and both of those are normal for researchers. We're used to doing that. But the thing that is not normal is also elaborating on your fiscal stability. And in this respect, their proposals are more like a nonprofit foundation proposal, where you need to provide extra documentation that you can ethically manage your grant funding. And to do this, you need to work with your grants office to describe your fiscal stability. Okay, as I mentioned on the previous slide, HRSA's page limits range in between 30 and 80 pages. And note, while they do want to streamline and adhere to the uniform guidance directives, HRSA is one of the worst for having each call have their own unique quirks. And a lot of those quirks have to do around what is counted within your page limits. So, with this in mind, what is often included in HRSA page limits? These are just very general, but double check your RFP because each RFP is different and what's on your screen may or may not be counted. What is almost always counted, both for HRSA and for any other federal funding agency, is your project narrative. That's normal. Then we get to the budget narrative, which is weird. It's not common for other federal agencies to count that in your page limit, but it's not unheard of. I'm okay with that. And then we get to the table of demographics, site data, training data. Those are all pretty expected. They usually show up in the project narrative. We would expect that in our page limit. Now we get into the really weirdness that is HRSA. So we saw more than one opportunity that I looked at this year wants the subaward budgets included in the page limit. And that's not just the narratives. They want the R&R budget form, which is usually part of your grant application package in grants.gov. This is weird. I know of very few other federal agencies that require this in the page count. Same goes for the project performance site location form, which is a standard application form in grants.gov, usually not counted towards your page limit in any other federal agency, but HRSA, again, more than one call that I looked at, required this in your page count. Now let's dig into some of the attachments, which hit or miss whether or not these are normal. We have your accreditation documents. Again, this is something that other federal agencies wouldn't count, but that HRSA is counting in a lot of their opportunities. The org chart, that's usually expected, especially if you have a management plan, it counts towards your page limit, no matter who your funding agency is. Then we get into biosketches, which is sometimes counted for other agencies, but often counted for HRSA. So make sure you're counting those in your page limits, but double check your RFP. Then we get to works cited, also known as your bibliography. Most other federal agencies don't count that, but HRSA does. So again, check your RFP, but in most cases that does count towards your page limit. Same with your letters of support or collaboration. Those are going to likely count towards your page limit in HRSA, maybe not in other agencies. And then templates, samples, survey questionnaires, data collection instruments, clinical protocols, all of these other attachments, while they usually have a limit on the number of attachments in other agencies, in HRSA, they actually count towards your page limit. And so if you have a very long clinical protocol, that could really impact how your project, how many pages your project narrative has. So I also want to note some things that are often not included, but again, check your RFP because maybe they are. And that is your abstract, your lead agencies are in our budget. So your budget form, which we would normally expect, and any other OMB forms and R&R package templates. So your grants.gov application templates usually aren't counted, but again, see the examples above where they did. So double check your RFP. And because of all the weirdness here, I highly recommend that before you write your HRSA proposal, you create a page allocation table that you use to inform how you collect everything. Because you don't want to get to the end of this collecting of documents and writing your narrative and writing the other pieces and realize, oh my God, I'm 10, 20 pages, 30 pages, double the limit of page allocation, and I'm going to have to figure out how to cut that back in the next 12 hours before I submit this thing. You want to not give yourself that headache. Don't give yourself that struggle. Know beforehand how much pages to allocate for each document. Okay. Now let's move on to the review process and review criteria. This will inform how you write your grant. So this review process is very similar to, say, an NIH grant, but you are going to be scored on very specific criteria that I'm going to get into soon. Like your NIH grant, your proposal will be reviewed by a panel of independent experts. However, maybe unlike NIH, some of these experts may or may not be in your field. They could be experts who understand the needs of your target population or community. So write so that anybody can understand your proposal. Each of our reviewers are going to review 6 to 8 applications, which is quite a bit. I was recently on a panel where I reviewed 10, and that was a lot of work. So make your proposal easy to read for your reviewer. Review your panel. So once your reviewers get your proposal, they're going to review it, develop a consensus together, identify strengths and weaknesses, and go ahead and give you a summary of the strengths and weaknesses when they give you a funding decision. And then after the reviewers review it, they're going to move that up to the HRSA program managers and the people above them to make the final funding decision. And note, even if you score highly, this is one agency where that score doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be funded. And this is because HRSA, more than other agencies, has a whole list of potential reasons why they may want to fund one project over another. So they're going to consider their own available funds, how risky it is to fund your organization. So have you defaulted on reports in the past, had audit findings, etc. They're going to look at HRSA's larger funding portfolio and how your proposal fits into that portfolio. They're looking for a diversity of project types as well as a diversity of geographic locations. So if you happen to unfortunately be in a location where they've recently funded, even if you score very well, you may not get funded. And because of all of these considerations, they may fund out of rank order, they may provide only partial funding, and they may choose to fund no applications. Okay, now let's look at two different review criteria, one for research and one for programmatic work. The opportunity on the screen comes to us from the Maternal and Child Health First Research Grant Opportunity. You'll notice that the need accounts for 10 points, and that corresponds to the needs assessment subsection of the specific aim section. So it's very specific in where these points count, and you can find that in the RFP. Note, the needs assessment is 6, and alignment with HRSA strategic plan and the Healthy People 2020 is 4 points. So you don't want to forget to address that alignment. That is an easy 4 points that it would take a couple sentences to make sure that that gets counted. Then moving on to the response section, this corresponds to the significance, goals, hypotheses of the specific aim section, and it's worth 20 points. Of those 20 points, 5 goes toward significance, which aligns with the scientific research gap. 5 goes towards addressing health equity, and 10 goes towards your hypotheses and goals. And within those hypotheses and goals, you want to identify your expected outcomes. So you'll notice here that HRSA places a lot of emphasis on having very clear, articulated, hypothesis-driven goals. And significance and addressing health equity are a bit behind goals and hypotheses in terms of emphasis. So we want to make sure our goals are clear, and our significance, while you also want to make that clear, can be a bit less robust than, say, an NIH or an NSF, where significance really drives whether or not you get funded, and you can have a little bit vaguer goal. Moving on to criterion 3, this is your study design and approach. It's worth 30 points. And that goes towards your study design approach section for 10 points, population description, sampling, and recruitment for 10 points, data collection for 5, and plan for data analysis 5. So again, that's actually a pretty even split across how you would develop your approach section. Then we move on to impact for 10 points, and that's split across scientific innovation and importance for 5, and public health impact and dissemination for 5. So if you've ever done an NSF grant, I would correspond this to intellectual merit for scientific innovation and broader impacts for that impact and dissemination piece. Moving on to resource and capabilities, this corresponds to the organizational information and environment section, with organizational capacities being 5 points and qualifications of key personnel being 10. So make sure your bibliography and anything, not bibliography, bio sketches, and anything within the text that describes your key people is well articulated, so you get those 10 points. And then your support requested section corresponds with your budget and budget justification. It's only worth 5 points. So while you do need to be very clear and align your budget with your program goals, it's worth 5 points. So I wouldn't put extra effort into your budget justification in describing things. Make it very clear, make your request known. Don't need to spend extra time on it. Then we move on to program assurances at 10 points. This covers the feasibility, the evaluation and technical support capacity, protection of human subjects, and targeted and planned enrollment sections. Your proposed timeline and evaluation counts for 6 points, and the human subject protections counts for 4. So again, like the budget, important, but just be clear in what you're describing for human subjects protections. Touch on everything that's needed. Maybe don't need to do some extra elaboration there. Okay, moving on to programmatic and grant criteria. This covers training, outreach, and center type grants. Let's look at the criteria for the Behavioral Health Workforce Education Training Program. Note that this opportunity does indicate that it gives special preference and additional points to certain indicators. So addressing funding area priority will add points, around 5 points per priority. And if you're interested in that, see the RFP. The funding preferences don't add points, but it does mean that you're more likely to be funded if you land in the top so many percentage points of a proposal. In this case, it's in the top 20%. And you can see all of that in the RFP review section. Now, note, for both of these to be considered to get those extra points or to get that extra preference, you may have to add additional information into your proposal. And for this grant, these requirements were hidden. They were not in the project narrative section where you would expect to see that you need to add additional information, but rather they were hidden in the review section. So again, this is a reminder to read your entire RFP so you don't miss critical documents. Okay, getting into our criteria. Again, like the research criteria, we have 10 points for introduction, purpose, and need, and that's driven again by participant trainee population needs and your response to those. So in the response section is 50 points, which is a significant amount more than those 30 points that we saw for research. And this is split pretty equally across the approach section, which is 20 points, and the high-level work plan, which is 20 points. That approach is kind of the broader methodology around how you're doing your program, and the higher-level work plan gets down into the tasks and how you break it out and how you're actually going to do the work. The training sites are 5 points, and the resolution of challenges, which is risks and alternative approaches, is 5 points. Then we get to the impact section, which is 20 points, and this corresponds to performance and reporting for 10 points and sustainability for 10 points. And then we move on to resources and capability, which is also 10 points and also includes performance and reporting in that and organizational information. This covers key person, their training, their experience, plus resources and partnerships that come to your proposal, your project. Including the evaluator, which is why that evaluation piece is in there. And then in this case, your budget counts for 10 points. And so when your budget counts for a bit more than those 5 points on the research one, this is double that. I would put a bit more effort into making sure that your budget really aligns with the program you're proposing, that you've described how you're going to fill any gaps in that budget with other resources around your project, and that you have a very robust budget narrative that not only describes why you need the costs, but how those costs are aligned with your objectives of your project. Okay, now that we know what to include in your proposal and how your proposal will be scored, let's move on to some of the weirdness of the HRSA grants. Let's first address the oddness in funding and budgeting of these grants. So note that similar to NIH, HRSA is going to award you your funding by year. So you're going to apply for multiple years, but they're only going to give you funding 1 year at a time. And then future years of funding are contingent upon your performance reports and the availability of appropriated funds. There's almost always going to be a limit on your salary amount that you can request, limited at executive level 2, which is currently $221,900 for 2024. And again, this is the same as most HHS organizations. They have a salary limitation. Watch for limitations on who can be your PI. For example, maybe the PI can only submit one application for this funding opportunity, or they can be on no more than 2 active awards, different things that limit how much work your PI can be doing. They may also limit how much time you can commit for your PI. And they do this to promote diversity of their awardees. So for example, in the Maternal and Child Health First grant, it limits PIs with active awards to no more than 10% time on new awards. So if you have other funding from HRSA and this PI has a PI on those awards, they are only going to be able to have their salary funded for 10%. Now you can, of course, support the research through all other methods. So you can have your students on there, you can have other researchers on there, you can have all your supplies on there, everything else can be supported, but the salary of your lead PI can only be 10%. Also watch for cost share. Although not as prevalent as it used to be on HRSA awards, it's still occasionally out there, so read your RFP. However, this requirement of cost share, I think, has been replaced with something that they're calling maintenance of effort. I'm making a face because as somebody who used to do budgets, this sounds an awful lot like cost share to me, but they are not requiring you to count it as cost share toward the development of your indirect cost rate. So what do they mean by maintenance of effort? They want to see that the program or project that you're proposing is supported by funds beyond the grant, both during the time period of the grant and beyond the time period of the project. So for example, let's take one of our scholarship or training grants. And in these grants, you may be provided funding only to support the student, or those funds that you have available beyond the support of the student may be limited by budget constraints, so you can't fund everything that you want to accomplish in terms of curriculum, in terms of student support programs through the grant funding. And HRSA wants to know how much funding you will provide outside of the grant to support the pieces that aren't funded by the grant. So both during the time period of the grant, to complete those tasks that aren't included in the grant costs, and then they also want to know beyond the period of grant, especially for programs that have students that are graduating after the project terms. They want to know that the level of stipend support or the level of program support behind those students will not disappear when the grant ends, but will continue until that student graduates. So you need to figure out where this other funds are coming from in order to support the programs and the curriculum and the students after the grant terms. And also note, many of these training and scholarship grants limit indirect cost to 8%, which means this limits how much you can leverage F&A returns to backfill those pieces of the grant that may not be funded by the direct costs of that grant. So again, you're going to have to look for other sources of funding to support your program and articulate that in your grant. Now note, these restrictions on F&A costs are not usually applied to research grants, outreach grants, or center grants unless that grant also includes a significant training component. Let's look at some of the non-standard sections that HRSA may require. So most funding opportunities in HRSA have a pre-application technical assistance webinar. And I highly recommend that you attend this webinar, as they'll have many tips that can help you identify potential application hiccups and challenges to the writing process. The one thing that's really lucky about HRSA is they have very, very clear guidelines about what they want you to present in your project narrative, giving you very clear sections and information to include in each section. And this is great, but it also could lead to an application that provides more detail than your page limits are going to allow. So it's kind of a writing balance and balancing act. You need to be very specific in what you're describing, but succinct in how you describe it. Also note that because of these clear guidelines, this makes HRSA a great first-time grant for anybody who's new to submitting grants, to writing a proposal. Their requirements and structures help you understand both what's needed for HRSA grants, but also what other funders may require especially for funders who don't have very clear, specific guidelines of what they want in your project narrative. For example, NSF is rather succinct and general in how they describe what they want in the project narratives. But if you do a HRSA grant, you'll know, oh, these are the different types of information we need to include even in an NSF grant. So another thing to consider for many HRSA grants, they're going to require that you provide demographic data underlying the need for your grant. So make sure you know where to get this data. If it's a training program, you may need to get it from your university's institutional research section office. If it's community data, you may be pulling that from community reports, from community organizations, or from federal databases, wherever you need to get that data. Know where to get it and put somebody on that task as early as possible so that you can gather that information so you can use it to write your grant. Note that some grants have required performance metrics dictated by HRSA, not by you, that they want you to use for your program or your project. And this is going to impact how you write your project plan, so make sure you understand those evaluation metrics before you begin writing. Some proposals also require an organizational information section, and so for those of you who are academic institutions, this can get kind of tricky. It's a section where you describe the mission, structure, and scope of your current activities and explain how all of these pieces support your ability to carry out the proposed program. This doesn't mean that you need to describe the entire university, because unless this is a university-level grant, likelihood is that this is more of a college-level grant, a department-level grant, or even a grant for your individual group. And instead, what you want to do is write it in such a way that it applies only to that group. And finally, many HRSA grants require that you describe how your team will follow your work plan, account for federal funds, and record costs to avoid audit findings. And these latter two pieces, or all of these pieces, are things that you need to be considering at the proposal stage to understand if you have personnel capacity to actually accomplish this. So do you have somebody to gather data and information for those performance reports? And do you have somebody on staff who can do oversight and management of the grant funds? And if you don't have either one of those people already on staff and with time to do it, you might have to consider hiring new people for those roles. And whether or not that's going to come out of the grant budget depends on how much funds are in the grant, or if you need to fund that out of something else. And one more thing to note around these pieces, for the proposal document, you may need to work with your current grants administrators to describe the exact processes that they take to account for federal funds and record costs in such a way that those costs don't generate audit findings. And if you're a non-academic institution, this would be your finance people you'd want to talk to. Okay, moving on to our last two slides. Here I want to highlight what we might expect in general of both research and programmatic grants. So looking at research grants, these types of grants can be awarded either as a grant or as a cooperative agreement. Grant, you have pretty much free rein to do whatever you want with those funds, but with a cooperative agreement, you need to work closely with HRSA on defining your deliverables and on the data that you will produce. This happens both during the review process and once awarded. As part of being a cooperative agreement, many of these RFPs require that you have specific outcomes. That's another way in which HRSA gives you direction in terms of how they want this project to go. So both specific outcomes and specific evaluation metrics, which I've already talked about the evaluation metrics. But some of the outcomes, for example, for the Maternal and Child Health First grant that HRSA requires, is that you have at least 3 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals. So that's very directive. They want very specifically 3, at least. Other federal funders just want you to publish. These guys need you to publish at least 3. They also want you to work with at least one partner from the community, and recruit study participants from that community, and then disseminate the results of your research study back to the community, and more broadly to via non-academic means such as blogs, reports, social media, guidelines. So moving on to your project narrative, this requirement component is similar to NIH in terms of structure and what they want described. So again, you need to explain your need, your impact of your study, both for the population and for your research gap, for contributing to the body of knowledge. That needs to be backed by a lit review as well. And as mentioned before, your goals need to be hypothesis-driven. Your study design needs to have preliminary results to back up your approach, and also needs to identify risks and alternative approaches. Note, the biggest thing about HRSA research grants is that while you can do research to advance the field, they do want you to do that, they also want you to often address and enhance priorities that HRSA is interested in. So they have their own community impact programs, and a lot of the calls want you either to gather data or research evidence to back a need for that community impact program. They're less open for you to just do really good research, although they do want you to do good research. They're just not out there willy-nilly giving out funds for any type of research. You're going to have to figure out how to fit what you want to do into HRSA's goals and priorities. And as we discussed in the previous slides when we talked about data gathering, outreach, and the center grants, all of those were examples of how you might have to do that for aligning your research with HRSA goals. Okay, finally, let's look at the programmatic grant general requirements, and this covers training grants, scholarships, outreach grants, and center grants. So these requirements and processes are similar to NIH training, fellowship, and center grants. So if you've had experiences with those, these would also apply. When you're writing your proposal, you need to consider the barriers to attainment for your trainee or for your population of impact. And these need to be non-academic barriers such as prohibiting public or physical health, psychological health, physical environment restrictions, social environment restrictions, and economic stability for your population. You need to address both the trainee and or the population need, the region, and also the regional and local needs for your program or project. If you're doing a training grant, you need to define your recruitment, training, matriculation, and job placement process, including how you match mentees with their supervisors or mentors. And if you're doing something like a center grant, you need to consider how the center is greater than the sum of its parts. How does it develop an ecosystem? How does information and knowledge and people flow throughout the system? How do people get recruited into the system, onboarded, work in the system, and eventually flow out of the system? You'll want to describe this process well in your proposal. And also, much like your research grants, program evaluation for these projects must address a continuous quality improvement. That is, they are going to want formative and summative evaluations and have an iterative improvement process for how the program advances. Your evaluator, according to HHS evaluation policy, must be a non-biased party external to the program. So in a university, this could potentially be somebody within your university who is not associated with the program, or it could be somebody external to the university who provides those services. Another thing to consider with programmatic grants, especially trainee grants or participant achievement grants, you may have to track those participants after the grant funding ends. And that's because many of these opportunities require you to follow up with the participants 1 year after they phase out of the grant in order to understand the impact that the program had on them. So you're going to have to do a follow-up 1 year after they exit, whether or not the grant is still ongoing. And then finally, for programmatic grants, you often have a sustainability section that you need to use to describe how the advances made in this program or center continue after HRSA funding terminates. So either how do we continue funding this program, or how do we use the things we learn in this program to continue advancing your other programming. With that in mind, I hope you learned something in this webinar. And if you have any questions or want to learn more, you can reach out to me at maureen@affinitygrants.com or drop comments into the comment sections below.